Hi there, this is a special holiday edition of Power and Politics. I'm David Cochrane. Today we're counting down the top 5 newsmakers that dominated Canadian politics in 2024. Who drove the biggest stories and stirred up the most political drama? We've got a special power panel here to look back at who dominated this year's news cycle. Laura D'Angelo is a former advisor to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Tim Powers is a former strategist for Conservative parties. Paul Wells is a journalist and author. And Jordan Leichnitz is a former NDP strategist. All right, gang, let's get right into it. Ranking at number 5 on our top Canadian political newsmakers for this year.
We've landed a new deal. It'll be the largest deal in Canadian history. We've shown that political stripes don't matter. We're going to work hand in hand with the federal government. Carbon tax is the worst tax you could ever put on the backs of the people. We need to start building. This is a no-brainer. You don't put 4, 6, 8-story buildings in the middle of a community. Our government will provide every Ontario taxpayer a $200 tax-free rebate. So any government, I don't care what political stripe, wants to put more money back into people's pockets, good for them. Everyone agrees that we need a bilateral trade deal with the U.S. We have to take the threat seriously from President Trump. It's going to be a Team Canada approach. We are stronger together. Look forward to tightening up the border. All the premiers agree. We will go to the full extent, depending on how far this goes. We will go to the extent of cutting off their energy.
Okay, the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, is number 5 on this year's list of top newsmakers. And Tim, it's sort of a finish strong pick with Doug Ford and the role that he's adopted as the premiers emerge more in the Canada-U.S. relationship at the end of this year.
Well, you think where Doug Ford started off as premier, we've seen chaos in Ottawa before Christmas, but there was chaos in the early days of the Ford administration. It didn't look like he'd last very long. Now, as we close out 2024, head into 2025, he is arguably the most influential premier, not just because he's the Premier of Ontario or the chair of the Council of the Federations. He seems to be, as it relates to the relationship issues with the United States, leading the charge. He seems to have done a lot of work, and you and I both talked to other premiers, in building strong relationships with the premiers. Yes, from time to time he does freelance and used to get him in more trouble, but now it's just, oh, that's Doug. He probably has the most power that he has ever had on the national stage right now. And again, not because of just the chairmanship of the Council of the Federations, but he's found a way to connect not just with Ontarians, but Canadians around their anxieties of the moment internationally. And because the federal government has been a chaotic, hot mess over the last number of months, comes across as a voice of reason often.
Which is an interesting evolution for Premier Ford. But, you know, Jordan, it's interesting. There's still the Greenbelt investigation, housing starts, unemployment. These are all challenges in Ontario, worse than in other parts of Canada. He's very smartly focused on affordability, whether you think the measures are a gimmick or not. It's resonating. And now he's taking on this big role on cable networks in the United States.
Yeah, I think that the strong finish of his year this year is fascinating when you consider that some of the underlying measures for people in Ontario aren't that good. And actually, Ford himself is the least popular premier in the country. So it's something very special that he's doing politically in order to sort of insulate himself and take this leadership role in, I think we can argue, a vacuum of federal leadership, and be seen as the one who's confronting this challenge with U.S. tariffs. I think that he's also spent his time politically on some issues that are very divisive, and that's quite intentional. So things like bike lanes, things like the luxury spa at Ontario Place, things like the Ontario Science Centre. And these are some things also that, you know, and we saw this with the Greenbelt, could be his Achilles heel when he's seen to be rewarding his friends in a way that financially benefits insiders. This, I think, is more than likely going to be the thing that ultimately undoes him, but not anytime soon.
Paul, it's interesting. He's the Premier of Ontario, the Chair of the Council of the Federation, and seemingly the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, all at the same time as he goes to the U.S.
And it's not as though he's without detractors, and it's not as though he's got a blemish-free record, right? It's all blemish, and he's got nothing but detractors. I mean, in the Conservative Party of Ontario, there are an awful lot of Conservatives who think it'd be swell if they had a Conservative as Premier, and they don't think he qualifies. He makes it up as he goes along. He frequently admits to error. You played a montage of clips at the top of the segment, stitched together from various speeches, but that's what his actual speeches sound like. It's like a montage of clips. But he tied with Elphaba from Wicked as the year's greatest defier of gravity, largely because you didn't see that one coming. Largely because the opposition remains stubbornly divided.
Yep. Surprisingly, that's number 4 on our list, is the character from Wicked.
Elphaba from Elphaba. There you go.
There you go.
Yeah. Well, look, blemishes, they don't stop for getting on a top 5 list, Laura, and we'll talk about maybe the Prime Minister a little bit later. But, on Doug Ford, I mean, what do you make of the year he's had, and certainly the emergence of this new role towards the end?
I think it's remarkable. We often use the word Teflon to describe Doug Ford and a few other politicians, but I don't think it applies to anyone quite as well as it applies to Doug Ford. You have all of these scandals, and yet, even though he's the least popular premier, he's still very popular. We're on the precipice of him winning a third majority in Ontario. We're very close to, political dynasty territory for Doug Ford, and that's remarkable given where he started in 2018.
Yeah, I mean, least popular, we're talking about the Angus Reid approval ratings, right?
Yes.
Because in the public opinion polls in Ontario,
Very
Tim, he is going to cruise past, Marit Stiles and Bonnie Crombie unless something dramatically changes, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, that's what our Abacus data shows. But just picking up something Laura said, I mean, I think the last big prominent Ontario premier would be Bill Davis. Mike Harris may disagree with that. I mean, no offense, Mr. Harris, but what a difference in styles, right?
Yeah.
If Davis was cerebral and of the mode of the 1980 leader, could speak at length in sentences that actually fit together, Paul, and paragraphs that work.
Tough to montage.
Ford, even before Poilievre, found a way to connect with people, right? And the way he speaks to them and speaks with him. And that homespun, I was a counselor, here's my cell phone number. It's the moment for that. Again, Paul's right to suggest what his political pedigree is anybody's guess. But he has an ability to make people feel like he is hearing them and connecting with them, and that's really important right now.
I think your point about counselor, he has that municipal politician's sensibility and connection with normal people. Quick thoughts?
I was going to say, I think to Paul's point, it's exactly the magic. He's not ideological. He's not partisan. He's a populist in really the purest sense of the word, and that allows him to do some things politically that other politicians would have trouble inhabiting authentically. So things like reversing himself and apologizing, going back on things that prove to be errors once they're floated in the public opinion. He can do that, I think, in a way a lot of politicians can't. Doesn't mean that he needs to be loved, but his careful calibration of keeping the Ontario Liberals and NDP exactly in balance is going to help him sail through to victory.
The admitting you made a mistake is the last thing politicians like to do, but sometimes it's the best thing a politician can do because it humanizes you.
It's also very hard to do it well, though, and he does.
This is true. This is very true. Okay, Doug Ford is number 5. Coming up, we continue our countdown of the top political newsmakers of the year. Number 4 is coming up next. Welcome back to this special holiday edition of Power and Politics. Today, we're taking you through the top 5 newsmakers that dominated politics in 2024. Number 5 was Ontario Premier Doug Ford. Let's get on to the number 4 political newsmaker of the year.
Who's ready for affordable homes, affordable food, affordable gas?
The Prime Minister is quadrupling the carbon tax, doubling housing costs, and giving the worst inflation in 40 years.
Justin Trudeau is a big talker and a little doer.
Crime, chaos, drugs, and disorder are common in our streets, and he divides to distract from all that he has broken. Everything on which the Prime Minister spends gets worse and more costly. Common sense Conservative governments will approve our resource projects. We will repatriate the production and paychecks to this country.
Your home, my home, our home. Let's bring it home.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre comes in at number 4 on our list of top newsmakers. The Power Panel is back with Jordan Leichnitz, Laura D'Angelo, Tim Powers, and Paul Wells. Jordan, you could argue he could be much higher on this list, even number one. Dominated the polls, drove the agenda, won some key by-elections, seems poised to become the next Prime Minister of Canada.
Yeah, I think the lead that we're seeing from Poilievre and the Conservatives, so over 20 points, now closing in on about 18 months of that lead, is remarkable. And the fact that they've been able to hold it is equally interesting. I think one of the things that's notable about Poilievre is that, not unlike Ford we talked about, he's not necessarily loved, but he is loved in comparison to Justin Trudeau. So Justin Trudeau is also a really important player in Pierre Poilievre's popularity.
Laura, what do you make of this? I mean, a lot of his popularity and success this year has come at the expense of the party to which you belong, but he has been a consistent messaging and polling machine and a fundraiser.
And I think you hit the nail on the head. Machine. It is almost robotic, the way he is able to stick to his message, use his three-word taglines that resonate. It is constant beating Canadians over the head with his message that is landing, and it resonates. I think part of what Pierre Poilievre has done this year that is so impressive is understood the moment that Canada is in, put it in simple terms, and regurgitated it back non-stop. And I think one of the things that's so interesting is, even if he's not always the center of the news, he is always making the news. It is almost like every federal politician in Canada is responding to Pierre Poilievre every day this year.
Yeah, Paul, he's had an uncanny ability to read the mood, meet the moment, and put it into a slogan and a policy that he can then drive home his message with.
It's funny because he hasn't always been the most effective communicator. He was in charge of handing out checks before the 2015 election for Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and he turned his office into a video production facility, and it went nowhere. He purposely lay low for a couple of years after the 2015 Conservative defeat, and it wasn't obvious that he would be as effective as he has been. And yet he's defined politics, and to some extent not even only federal politics. I mean, the only explanation I have for why Sean Fraser is leaving federal politics is, on top of all everyone's got family they want to see more of and stuff. Yeah. But it's that Poilievre personalized the link between Fraser and two hot button issues, which are housing and immigration, and he ran out of any possibility to make his own message. Valérie Plante is not going to run again as mayor of Montreal. I think that started when Pierre Poilievre started telling anyone who listened that she's incompetent. He is somebody you don't want to cross. And he is, it's not obvious to me how he could lose steam between now and a federal election.
Yeah, Tim, it's been a level of discipline on messaging and focus, and of the caucus, to be quite frank, right? You don't see MPs stopping to scrum if they're conservative, but it's been that relentless focus that has worked for them throughout the year.
It has indeed. Look at a few points. I mean, I haven't seen an opposition leader ascend like this since perhaps Brian Mulroney in 1983 to 84. Interestingly, of course, in those circumstances, coming off the current Prime Minister's father with Mr. Turner in there. So certainly Pierre has been advantaged, as Mr. Mulroney was, by a Liberal Party in decline. That said, in the case of both Mr. Mulroney and Pierre, they have not stepped poorly or wrongly at this juncture, which speaks to that discipline. Picking up on what Paul said, Paul and I, and you to a degree, David, have seen Pierre over the last 20 years. He has certainly grown as a political figure. There were many, Paul is not wrong to say, who never necessarily envisioned Pierre Poilievre being on the precipice of being the Prime Minister of Canada. He himself, I think, has, and you have to admire his conviction for all of this. What's going to be fascinating now is how he keeps this momentum up and how he manages expectations should he win. Because there are a lot of things he has said and he's promising to do, which all opposition leaders do, that I think because of the base and the audience that he has, if he's not able to have a lot of early political wins, could prove problematic, but I think he'd welcome that challenge should he become Prime Minister.
Well, Paul, I saw you just react to that, is managing the expectations, because Donald Trump promised to make life more affordable, as Poilievre is promising to make life more affordable, and now he's saying, it's going to be tough to bring down the price of groceries, because the reality of what you can actually do, even from the seat of power, to change certain economic fundamentals is tough.
It's a there's a lively ongoing debate within his own Conservative caucus that I'm only very partially privy to about what kind of Prime Minister he's going to be, whether he's going to be a Prime Minister of conviction or a Prime Minister who, like Stephen Harper, keeps finding reasons not to do stuff. And if he does follow through, will he be able to keep the public with him? And will he have any patience for the complexities of policy files, or is it all going to be marketing? A lot of what he does, he's superb at a certain kind of shtick. And the shtick won't work as well when you're in the chair. When you're the Prime Minister of Canada and something goes badly wrong, it doesn't help to say, look, I need you to understand that the Mayor of Montreal is a jerk. Like that, you know.
Yeah.
This is something I hear from people on his team.
Well, I wonder about that, Laura, because one of the things, you know, as a member of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Mr. Poilievre doesn't spend time speaking with people who don't agree with him. You can't avoid that in the Prime Minister's office the way you can in the opposition leader's office. That's going to be a thing he's going to have to adapt to if he wins.
Yeah, you can't avoid that at all. And I think even in the last couple of months, we've seen Pierre Poilievre wobble a little bit on his messaging and wobble a little bit when things aren't going his way. We've seen some pretty combative moments with the press gallery. We've seen a little bit of gleefulness, I would say, particularly over the past week. And those tendencies right now we only see momentarily. When he's in the big chair, you have to answer for your decisions every day. It's easy to be on this side, or easier to be on the side that he's on now, critical and pushing. It's much harder to have to answer the question every day.
Jordan, he's going to have to face an election campaign at some point in 2025. What kind of a test do you think that might be for Mr. Poilievre next year?
Well, power is a great form of discipline, and I think that's really what you're seeing from the party. The Conservatives can be a divided bunch, but none of that is in evidence right now because they're winning. And I think I would expect that to carry through the campaign. I think that where it's going to get a little trickier is if and when he becomes Prime Minister, making some of those decisions that are going to be less popular. He's been cagey in the past, for example, about what he's going to do around social programs. Is he going to cut things like pharmacare, dental care, childcare? Those are going to be tough decisions that are going to come with real consequences when he's actually in the chair. The opposition, though, has had a really tough time making that case, and I think, you know, there's an interesting discussion to be had about why there's not negative advertising happening to make this point. But without that, it's tough to really bring that risk home to voters.
It could be because he has all the money in politics in Canada. That's just a guess. Okay, Pierre Poilievre, number 4. Coming up, we continue our countdown of the top political newsmakers of the year. Number 3 and number 2 are next. Welcome back to this special holiday edition of Power and Politics. Today we're taking you through the top 5 newsmakers that dominated politics in 2024. So far, we have the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, at number 5, Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre at number 4, and now for our number 3 newsmaker of this year.
This government, my government, will continue to step up on the fight against climate change. They have an opportunity to vote with middle-class Canadians, and they're choosing to vote against them. There's always going to be lots of reflection after a tough loss, but there's also so much to do. The conversations that we're all having as Liberals are going to continue. The Liberal Party, as is the Liberal government, totally united on holding the Conservative Party to account. We're going to continue to have great conversations about what is the best way to take on Pierre Poilievre in the next election, but that'll happen with me as leader.
What is it you want to do in a 4th term that you couldn't do in the first 3?
Oh no, it's continuing to meet the moment for Canadians.
Number 3 goes to the country's leader, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. The special holiday edition of the Power Panel is back. Jordan Leichnitz, Laura D'Angelo, Tim Powers, and Paul Wells. Laura, the Prime Minister always makes a lot of news. This is also a year we had a lot of news happen to him. Your thoughts on Justin Trudeau at number 3?
I'm a little surprised he's number 3 and Pierre Poilievre was number 4, if I'm honest. It feels like this was a year where Justin Trudeau responded to Pierre Poilievre a lot. And even things that the Prime Minister and his government had to communicate about that were great, in my opinion, like dental care and pharmacare and a school food program, Canadians don't want to hear it. They don't want to listen. right now. And a big part of that is the palace intrigue. When will there be an election? Will Justin Trudeau lead them? But a big part of that is that Pierre Poilievre has driven that narrative for Justin Trudeau.
Right. Jordan, what are your thoughts on the Prime Minister and his 2024?
What a rough year.
Yeah.
I think what's so interesting to me is that, of course, he's closing out the year in a moment of particular crisis. But over the course of the year, we've seen the Liberals and the Prime Minister try a number of things to turn the ship around. You know, they've tried mini shuffles. They've tried turning to more populist economic policies. They've tried everything except, of course, the one thing, which is changing their leadership. And none of it has worked. And so I think that the crisis point that we've arrived at the end of the year wasn't just one that was made in a day, of course. We have this whole year of poor decisions, poor results, and things that have left them in the position that they're in right now.
Tim, every time he tries to shuffle his cabinet, then they lose a minister and then end up losing a by-election, and then they lost the deputy prime minister and the finance minister.
Yeah, he's a guy he'd love to play in a game of cards because he never gets a full deck these days because they're gone everywhere. But first I want to know, has he found his jaw yet from the punch he took from Chrystia Freeland just before Christmas? Look, three things about the Prime Minister. He has moved from being loved in 2015 to being loathed. There's lots of reasons for that, but that's where he is. And he is not just disliked, he is loathed, other than by, apparently, according to Ipsos read, 19% of Canadians. That is staggering if that number is right. Secondarily, the Prime Minister and his team, I think still part of the reason he hangs on is he sees the Pierre Poilievre, Paul and I were talking about in a previous segment, the 2004, 2005 chirpy, annoying MP who hasn't grown politically. And I think that's a major mistake. Finally, I think, the one thing the Prime Minister can maintain some credit for at the moment, the reason he hasn't gone is he still controls his party. And that, perhaps, right now is the one legacy item for him that is good. It's going to fall to pieces in different ways when he goes. The Liberals will rebuild, but why he stays and how he maintains the passion for the job is baffling to me.
Paul, I know you have enough thoughts on Justin Trudeau to fill a book, because you wrote one this year. What are your thoughts on this?
I think he's going to have a good story to tell about his time as Prime Minister from the perspective of history, right? Serious first draft of reconciliation with Indigenous Canadians, serious effort on climate policy, survived Trump 1, survived COVID. But the longer he drags this out, the longer it's going to take before anybody is in a mood to get to that part. And he has shown, I would argue strongly since 2019, if not earlier, a remarkably limited ability to adapt to changing circumstances, to recognize his own weaknesses, and to read the political terrain. It's funny, once on a trip down to Washington, a delegation went down to visit with Barack Obama. On the way back, he bragged to reporters about how well he had read the political environment on his way to becoming Prime Minister, and that he's compared himself to Trump at the time. At some point, that just went away. He's really got no sense of where Canadians are, what Canadians think. And to the extent he understands that there are Canadians who disagree with him, he almost always chalks it up to disinformation. Someone's feeding them a line. They don't really understand how great things are. And once you start reacting that way, it's done.
Yeah. Well, you talked about changing circumstances. Laura, you talked about your surprise he was number 3. That's because number 2 and number 3 are kind of a package deal. Here's number 2 on our list of top political newsmakers.
Canadians have economic whiplash. It has been a really hard time.
Our economic plan is working.
We need to invest in middle-class Canadians.
The Prime Minister has my full support.
There have been multiple reports that the Prime Minister's office is questioning your abilities as Finance Minister.
Or was that a yes or no as to whether you had received assurances that you will be continuing as Finance Minister?
I do have the confidence that I need to do my job effectively. I feel I have the support I need to do my job. I am really looking forward to delivering the fall economic statement.
on Monday.
Chrystia Freeland this morning has decided to leave cabinet, to leave her position as finance minister and deputy prime minister.
This news has hit me really hard.
We have a good relationship with Chrystia over the years. I just want to wish her all the best.
So I'm proud of her record, and I look forward now to assuming the responsibility of being Minister of Finance.
Former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance Chrystia Freeland finishes this year by zooming to one of our top spots. Laura, because a Zoom conversation with the Prime Minister went sideways, she was not on this list when we did the initial draft, but she finished the year with an explosive exit from Cabinet, and this is why 2 and 3 go together right now. What are your thoughts on Chrystia Freeland?
I mean, I've said it before on your show. I think December 16th for Chrystia Freeland was a political communications masterclass, which isn't something we often say about her. No. But she delivered her resignation in the form of a letter that was scathing to the Prime Minister, but was also clear and concise. It came across as very authentic, and she stuck to that message all day long. She also, has potentially toppled the Liberal government, and certainly has put one of the final nails in the coffin, I think, of Justin Trudeau's leadership, whether that's now or, coming up shortly. And she is coming out looking very, very strong and very, very much like a leader herself.
Paul, just on the day when the Postal Service resumed, a letter from the Deputy Prime Minister was a hand grenade designed to inflict maximum damage with the way she wrote it and the way she did it and when she did it to the Prime Minister and the government.
Yeah, I'm not the only one who would say I didn't know she had it in her. Although she's a journalist, and she worked in the Financial Times Bureau in London for many years. And in London, this is how you leave cabinet, is with letters that take this tone and are this specific. She may have revived what would have been a seriously faltering shadow candidacy for the Liberal leadership at some point. She, in the week that she left, she showed up at 2 Liberal functions and got standing ovations from crowds that had not really been giving her a lot of standing ovations in recent months. And she joins the growing number of former Liberal cabinet ministers who have at last said what they thought. And she leaves the dwindling number of cabinet ministers who haven't yet said what they thought about all of this.
Jordan, it is remarkable that, a finance minister who really only popped up twice a year in a lot of ways to be in the news was on Budget Day and Fall Economic Statement Day. And on the Fez, as we call it, she made this dramatic and devastating move, but with real political stiletto finesse.
It is Shakespearean. The whole drama of what has happened between her and Trudeau, when you look at the arc of their working relationship together, she came on as a star candidate when Trudeau was not a sure bet.
2013, right?
That's
the by-election.
Yep. And she's been by his side ever since, carrying some of the most challenging files, not just finance, but as foreign affairs minister as well, leading the Canada-U.S. renegotiations. And then as finance minister, she's been his surrogate when they've campaigned. She's been able to carry the mantle for a lot of those things. And in return, what did she get? She got demoted over a Zoom call for somebody who may or may not have actually been offered and had accepted a position to come into cabinet. It was a brutal miscalculation on the part of Trudeau and the team around Trudeau about how she was going to accept that news. And in return, I think she's delivered just a fatal blow to Trudeau's leadership and to this government.
Tim, to Paul's point about her being a former journalist, I have one of these letters ready to go for when I leave the CBC.
But I'm happy to be your surrogate.
Yeah, well, no, you might be in it. No, I'm just saying. But this was something, right? And this is why, there is Freeland and there is Trudeau. And as I said when we introduced him, you make a lot of news as Prime Minister, but news happens to you. And he was blindsided by this, and the question is whether they can recover in any kind of fashion.
Yeah, it was a bit like Mike Tyson walking into the ring with Jake Paul and didn't fare so well. Yeah. But Jordan described it as Shakespearean. I'd describe it more as Lutherian. Not since Martin Luther nailed the letter to the door of the church and said, hey, we need reformation. Right. Has it been the case? Look, Again, I join the chorus of saying nobody knew she had it in her to this degree. I'm not sure I'd necessarily ascribe it to her journalistic skills, because not often, fellas, journalists are great politicians, no offense.
We can write withering critiques,
You
though,
can,
man.
though, and apparently letters still matter over Instagram. But what's fascinating to me, though, was the treatment, because I think this helps us understand more why he's having the troubles that he did. Again, let me invoke Mr. Mulroney, and we all know the history there. When Mr. Mulroney was down in the polling numbers and more people thought Elvis was alive than supported the Progressive Conservatives, he never had to deal with any of this. Why? Because he focused on managing his caucus and understanding human relations. What kind of disconnect do you have to have when you Zoom call arguably your most loyal soldier, other than Dominic LeBlanc, and say, hey, by the way, time's up. Sorry, you do this on Monday. Mark Carney's coming in, apparently, though Mark did not come in, of course. And then you think that a person who is as proud, as well-educated, who's fought as many battles for the Liberals as Chrystia Freeland did, is going to sit there and you'd say, yeah, sure, I'll do that for you on Monday. And the best you can do is apparently give her a title and no department, no resources and all of that. That speaks more to the miscalculation and misunderstanding that Justin Trudeau has about where his power base was in 2015 compared to now.
Yeah, I mean, Brian Mulroney had his Lucien Bouchard, but it was over a totally different set of circumstances. You know what I mean? It was the fundamental question about Quebec. But, you know, here, Laura, she quit cabinet, quit the posts, stayed in caucus, went to that caucus meeting, hugged the Prime Minister at the end of that caucus meeting, and in an email blast to people who supported her said, this is not the end of the road. What road is she talking about there, and how might that affect Justin Trudeau?
She sure did. And showed up at the caucus party, and by all accounts had longer lines for hugs and pictures than the Prime Minister did, which says something.
She got a standing ovation at caucus. I don't think he did. Yeah.
She sure did. I mean, listen, I don't know that we can infer anything other than Chrystia Freeland is going to be running for Liberal leader, whether that is while Justin Trudeau is leader and she, you know, attempts to take him out, or whether that is when he or if he chooses to step back on his own. But Chrystia Freeland, with that letter, and then with all of the subsequent moves, with that letter, she quite impressively changed her own narrative for time in government. She rebranded herself in a really impressive way. And then the next set of these steps, showing up at caucus, showing up at the caucus party, really clearly signals that she is gunning for the top job.
And Paul, like, that takes guts, you know, to do what you did that day, because the collateral damage of that hand grenade is the caucus and the government, and then to show up at the caucus meeting. But I wonder, like, as Laura says, rewriting the narrative from the finance minister who didn't have the political and the communication skills, which is what a lot of people said about her, to sort of being a heroine on the fall economic statement day, and now a possible leadership contender.
Yeah, now if she faces serious opponents in a leadership race, or failing that, if she becomes the leader and faces, you know, Pierre Poilievre, she's going to have some splaining to do. She was the minister that she was for all the years until she quit. She seems to have been ready to deliver that economic statement without many qualms until he asked her to make sure it was the last thing she ever did as finance minister. You know, she does have a mixed record, which will come back into view as the events of December 16th fade into the hindsight. But one of the things I've been kind of lamenting about this Prime Minister is that he seems never to understand that surprise is an option. Stephen Harper, Jean Chrétien would change the terms of a debate on their feet in the House of Commons a few times a month. And since Justin Trudeau has been incapable of doing that for the last couple of years, he has now seen what it's like to have it done to him.
Yeah, news happens to him, right? Yes. As much as he makes news. Jordan, your thoughts on what's next for Chrystia Freeland? I mean, we don't know if there's going to be a leadership, but it seems like she's in the mix now in a big way.
So she's now the unofficial leader of the rebellion, and you know, I think that we could go Star Wars here, but you know, this has absolutely, as Paul and Laura have said, this has really elevated her and covered, I think, a lot of the political skills that she lacked over the course of her time as finance minister. Now, if she runs for leader, there's no magic there, right? She still is not a great political communicator, maybe except for letter writing. She still struggles as a retail politician, and she's still out of touch with the lived reality of most Canadians. So that baggage is not going to go anywhere for her, and I think that you'll see that come more into focus as we get more distant from December 16th. But for today, she's absolutely changed the terms of the discussion and put herself in a leading position.
Tim, last 30 seconds to you.
Yeah, what's the trajectory from here? We're in the holiday period. She had a big bang. She's rewritten, as Laura said, her narrative a little bit, but she still has a long history of being central to all these key government decisions, which, when an election comes, will be put to the public to assess.
Okay, when the election comes, we know it's going to be sometime in 2025. We just don't yet know the date. But coming up, we're going to continue our countdown of the top political newsmakers of the year. Number 1 is next. Welcome back to this special holiday edition of Power and Politics. Today we're taking you through the top 5 newsmakers that dominated politics in 2024. So far we have Ontario Premier Doug Ford at number 5, Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre at number 4, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is number 3, and it's a package deal because his former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance Chrystia Freeland is number 2. And now the number 1 political newsmaker of 2024.
This trial is rigged. We have long been taken advantage of by other countries. They want Crooked Joe out of the race. Kamala, you're fired. I want to thank the American people for the extraordinary honor of being elected your 47th president. We can't have open borders. If it doesn't stop, I'm going to put tariffs on your country. Brought some of our compatriots along with us. They're going to do a beautiful job for you for the next 4 years. We will make America great again.
In the number 1 spot, U.S. President-elect Donald Trump. The special holiday edition of the Power Panel is back with Jordan Leichnitz, Tim Powers, Laura D'Angelo, and Paul Wells. And Paul, let's start with you. I mean, Donald Trump's end-of-year Facebook montage is going to be incredible. He has rewritten the laws of political gravity, avoided political and criminal accountability, and he's now going to be the most powerful man on earth for a second time.
Yes, and he's going to annex Canada.
Yes, so, yes, the 51st state here.
The big question in 2025 is it a different Donald Trump? Is it going to be a different kind of government from the one that he led from 2017? A lot of people rounded up and motivated by the Heritage Foundation hope that it will be a very different presidency, that essentially the Agenda 2025 playbook will bring order and purpose and effectiveness to his presidency that lacked the first time around. Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, then the people who don't like him are going to have even more reason not to like him, and the people who like him are going to have more reason to celebrate. But just the fact that he was able to come back after being impeached twice, after 34 criminal convictions, after having at least gazed benignly on an armed assault on the Capitol, well, it's a hell of a thing. I mean, it's the greatest. It's literally the greatest comeback in American political history.
It is unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yet it's happened. And and people may wonder, Jordan, why we've got a U.S. president as the number 1 pick on a Canadian political show. Look at what he's done to the Canadian political agenda already. NATO, the threat of tariffs, the consequences of mass deportations if he goes through with it is going to make Roxham Road look like a trickle in terms of what could be headed this way.
He's absolutely going to be defining the Canadian political scene for the next year and likely for the next 4 years. You've already seen it. It's fascinating the degree to which I think there were many in the Prime Minister's team who hoped that Trump's election would prove to be a springboard for the Prime Minister to regain some control, to get out of a reactive stance and to regain some popularity. That hasn't happened. I think in large part the blow that Chrystia Freeland dealt on her exit has derailed that. But you can see that there's both danger and opportunity politically for people in Canada and their reaction to that. We've seen the premiers taking up that space, Premier Ford. We've seen Pierre Poilievre looking uncharacteristically uncertain how to deal with Trump. And yes, on a policy level, absolutely. Those tariffs, if they're imposed, will be devastating to the Canadian economy. And Canadians are following this really closely. They understand and have a lot of anxiety about what this is going to mean for their jobs and their pocketbooks. And so politicians are going to need to respond.
Tim, it's completely rattled and shaken the Canadian political agenda, and he's not even officially in office yet. I mean, if the prologue is anything what the 4 years are going to be like, it's going to be a rough time.
Well, and the current obsession with the president-elect of just about every other day, mentioning that Canada is the 51st state, is annoying, if nothing else. I mean, if this is how foreign policy is going to be done now, I'm sure Henry Kissinger's rolled over in his grave about 3 million times thinking about it all. It's astounding, though, right? I mean, Trump hasn't, as you said, he hasn't followed a conventional political model. He has basically taken his model from when he was a reality television star and imported it to the most important democracy in the world and is going to govern that way. And this time without the same sort of, if there were, guardrails that were there before, because he's only got 4 years, as far as we know. Not to be hysterical, but look, you have to give him marks for being may be offensive to some, sorry, but he's a brilliant political communicator in a world where he can't be held to account despite the best efforts of your colleagues across the border. Facts don't matter. A construction of a sensible narrative doesn't matter. He connects emotionally with people in a way, or enough people in a way, that he's built this base that is so powerful. The last thing I'd say, he's also a product of the post-COVID era of politics, where anger came to the surface and it had nowhere to go. And Trump has harvested that in many people and used it to his advantage.
Look, if you go back to his days in New York in the 80s, Laura, he's probably done more media than any human being in the history of the world, right? From there to now. And to use his words, this is going to be an enormous challenge for Governor Trudeau, or maybe Governor Poilievre, depending on how the election goes, to deal with over the next little while.
Absolutely. And, I think one of the things that is interesting looking at this list, the other 4 people on this top 5 list have made news in their own right. They've responded to news. This list next year is probably going to be Donald Trump in the #1 slot, I would imagine, and 4 people for how they responded to Donald Trump, because he's setting the agenda worldwide. You are one of many shows doing a roundup, and I would put money on the fact that Donald Trump is #1 on probably every single one of those shows. And besides Barack Obama, maybe in 2008, I don't know that there's another person in memory that has that impact, and that is going to drive the decisions and decision making in Canada for probably the next 4 years.
It's interesting, Paul, to look at the Obama comparison, because his election was this sort of like huge leap forward for progress on equality in the eyes of a lot of Americans, by electing a black man to that office. Trump is pure disruption. Right? In that the Democrats tried to say it was a threat to democracy, and a lot of Americans said, well, democracy as it exists ain't working for me. So let's break it up a little bit.
A lot of people went to Washington billing themselves as disruptors and departures from business as usual. Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and a bunch of others, and George W. Bush. And they, in the eyes of a plurality of Americans, they represented business as usual. And so this guy came along and said, I'm actually going to be nothing like those people. And he has won twice. I know there are people who disagree, but to me that puts a large burden of introspection on the people who did everything they could to beat Donald Trump, to ask themselves why it didn't work.
Yeah, Jordan, he kind of, going back to some of the other conversations, there's whatever you think of Donald Trump, and he is polarizing, he is who he is, right? He doesn't apologize, he's unapologetic, but that is the authentic Donald Trump. There's an authenticity there that people believe in whether they should or not.
Absolutely, and it's his ability to connect. He doesn't talk like a politician. He talks like I don't know, like your drunk uncle at
I
Christmas
probably
dinner.
threw him out of a bar on George Street.
You might have.
know.
But I think that there's a hunger for that authenticity, and to what Paul was talking about. Look, I think that voters are not feeling that the institutions of democracy broadly, and we can speak about this in the United States, are serving them very well. And so I think there's a lesson here for progressive governments that if you are not capable of delivering, if you don't bring the change that you promise to bring, the backlash can be more than just political. Now we're staring down a genuine crisis of democracy in the United States. Trump is coming in better armed with information, with a clearer policy agenda, and with people who are ready to get in there and dismantle major government institutions in a way that I think many agree is going to have a very damaging effect on people's lives. But the reason that he was able to get that political purchase was because people felt betrayed by the promise of previous governments.
Well, it's interesting, and it's a much larger conversation, but Tim, I remember reading an essay in the New York Times about saying that Trump offers solutions free from moral constraint, whereas progressives offer moral constraint devoid of solutions. And he basically said, I'm going to help you, don't worry about everybody else, and that has an appeal.
Well, he appeals at a time when everybody wants everything instantly. We all pick up our phone, we want to hit a QR code, get what we want. He speaks that language, which also comes from his experience in the media and the like. He knows how to connect with people. But I mean, it truly is concerning. If in Trump 1 there were old, experienced hands who were going to keep things on the straight and narrow, and I don't know if they did or they didn't, January 6th decide. Now look at what we are getting, right? You have Elon Musk, yes, great commercial success, but his view of international relations isn't that far off Donald Trump, calling our Canadian Prime Minister, what a tool. I mean, that's great, guys, that the high school lunchroom is coming into the debate.
No, it's interesting. And all those old hands, they're all signing letters saying he's a fascist, and it didn't matter. It's been a very disruptive time, and we are out of time. I want to thank the Power Panel for being here. Jordan Leichnitz, Tim Powers, Paul Wells, and Laura D'Angelo. And thank you all for watching. I'm David Cochrane. Thank you for being here for this special edition of Power and Politics. More CBC News to follow right here on CBC News Network. Happy holidays.